So as I told Natalia, I didn't prepare a special talk for this, so I will use the slides that I made for Mama, but I will skip some because there it was much longer.
В общем, он мне до этого говорил, что он не будет специально готовить лекцию сюда, а использует некоторые слайды, которые были у него на лекции в МОМА, и какие-то, чтобы было не так все долго, будет пропускать.
А я просто так с микрофоном сижу.
Чуть позже пришла, а сейчас вот замерла.
Может быть, мы поменяемся?
Не-не-не, это сейчас...
So maybe just a few words to present myself. I have always been interested by sound and electronics, and when was the time to choose studies, my parents wanted me to do something serious, so I did engineering studies, and after that I studied music at the conservatory. And so basically what I was interested in when came the breakthrough of digital technologies was to recover this kind of very spontaneous gestures that I could have on a modular synth, and that suddenly with the interfaces available on the computer were usually not possible. You had like a virtual faders and you could only move one at a time with the mouse, or you could have keyboard commands, but to me it was not like an instrument. So I really worked into making digital processing available as instruments by using some sensors or some interfaces that are very common now, like MIDI faders or buttons, but that were less common in the early 90s. So my first aim was to do some tools that I could use to compose my music in the studio, and then when the computers became more powerful, I started to use them for live, and I started to use them mainly because it's been a 20-year collaboration with a contemporary choreographer. I used it for contemporary dance in many different ways, just at the sound desk to do some effects live, but also to follow the movements of the dancers. And then I had also some interactive installations. So I don't know exactly, I was told that most of you have a musical background, so I don't want to say things that you already know. When I studied at the conservatory, it was mainly in the direction of musique concrète, and in that kind of music, there's usually two steps in composing. The first step is to prepare sound material, and in the old days, like the end of the 40s, 50s, when Schaeffer started this in Paris, the idea was to take things that were making sounds, a microphone, moving the object, well, the bodies, and actually create what he called sound objects, which were the recording of the sound bodies. And the way to freely work with acoustical bodies in order to make recordings that would be later edited and mixed was something I wanted to find back using digital technologies. I wanted to have something as plastic, as flexible, so that I didn't have to write a score or write a list of parameters, draw evolution of parameters. I wanted to be able to play the instruments, because I really believe that when you play an instrument, you discover other modalities, you discover other parts of the potentiality of the instruments than if you have to decide beforehand what parameters, values you're going to assign. I guess most of you know a little bit about these technologies because they are much more common now. So the idea is to have some sound processing algorithm completely digital and have, on the other hand, some sensors, keyboards, faders, and then the crucial element is what we call the mapping, is how you assign the gestural controllers to the sound generation or transformation algorithms. And it is quite interesting actually sometimes to see how very simple sound processing algorithm can become very creative once you have an intuitive and control. I don't know if you, I guess you know you all know plugins, and I remember when came the first plugins of the GRM in Paris, the GRM tools, and there was one basic thing. It was a bandpass filter. It was a bandpass filter, but with the mouse you could change the frequency on the horizontal axis and the bandwidth on the vertical axis. And then suddenly, when you started actually making trajectories in this 2D space, you were creating something with the filter that you would never have done if you had to draw the things in advance. So to me, this is a little bit kind of the mantra that sometimes the sound processing algorithm is less important than the way you control it, because I strongly believe that the listener actually feels the gesture through the sound. And actually, this is also proven in other ways. You know that some people, in order to get characteristic of gestures, instead of having sensors, they are actually analyzing the sound of the acoustical instrument, and from the sound analysis they can determine in a certain way how the instrument was played. Like if you analyze the sound of a guitar, you can know where the string is plucked, and you can know actually how it was performed. As I kind of said, my first idea was this what we call now new digital lottery. It's making new instruments to work in the studio, and then there was this other thing, the interaction with the dancers and with the choreographer I was working with. At the beginning, she didn't want anything that would I don't find the word in English actually. Anything that would hinder the movements of the dancers. So actually she didn't want any worn technologies. She wanted that we did things distance sensing with ultrasounds, with camera, or contact sensing. We used a lot contact mics on surfaces, elements of scenographies that were actually touched or walked on by the dancers. What is interesting with dancers and also with working with that choreographer, actually she worked for 10 years with Stockhausen, so she is really trained into listening to music, and she's interested in it, not interested in the relationship between music and dance. So when you work with dancers, actually you rehearse a lot. And you get this kind of expert gesture, which is very similar to the expert gesture of a musician. And in some way, they become the musician of the show. And then the last application is more interactive installations. And there you absolutely have no idea of what the visitors are going to do. They might just watch the things without moving. They might sometimes be very inventive and make some kind of some jam sessions in between each other. And what I find interesting is to have some parameters that with sensor are mutually dependent, so that you create actually things with several visitors that you don't expect yourself. Because when you set it up, you're on your own and you cannot test all the possibilities. But then there's this element of surprise that I like. I'm going to, well, maybe I start with something very old actually, but it's I think I like the idea of the instrument. Okay. So. Back in the old days, I didn't have the possibility to make fast Fourier transforms or whatever, but I used just bandpass filters and MIDI frequency to MIDI tracking, so that I was doing the same sound several times through the analysis, changing the bandpass filter, and I got actually notes which corresponded to the energy in each frequency band. I recorded it to a sequencer, and then I wrote some algorithms that those notes could be changed by how I was playing a keyboard, and the notes I was playing on the keyboard were like magnets that was attracting the notes that have been recorded after the analysis. And I had some faders that could determine how much the force of the magnet was. So if it was put at maximum, all the notes analyzed would sound on the same note or on the several notes I was playing on the keyboard. I will maybe...
Простите, а можно просить перевести как-то, потому что я не очень понял это.
Вот в эту последнюю часть.
Да.
Да, вот с этой системой, как бы, с магнитом.
Not real magnets. It's like a virtual magnets. So I have plenty of notes that are the energy of the sound in the multiple frequency bands. And when I play a note on a keyboard, those notes, if let's say you have all those notes, the spectrum, I play this note and they are all attracted and they come closer to this note. And how close they come depends on the fader. So if I put the fader to the maximum, they all come to this note, and intermediary, so I can change the centroid of this amount of notes.
So it's a tool. It's a virtual magnet, which is the tool you constructed.
Yes, it's a program. It's a software, but it's just to show an idea of how you can make instruments that have nothing to do with acoustical instruments, but that you can still play, and when you're playing it, you actually get to some things that you wouldn't have imagined necessarily. I will play a small example, not exactly from the beginning. And one will hear there's not really the sound of water, but you will feel the energy that comes through the analysis, and then it's performed. Well, sorry, it's played by just synthesizers. Now I was too slow. So one layer is just filter sound, but the small bits come from the analysis. So it reminds the energy of drops of waters, but I can play with them. That's to give an idea of the type of instrument. And something I worked quite a lot with was granular synthesis. So the idea of granular synthesis or granulation is that you have a sound. There are many different techniques of granular synthesis. I should more call it granulation because I start from an existing sound. It's not generation, it's transformation. And if you imagine that this long rectangle is actually the sound sample that you have recorded. Then you will have grains that will take a small part of that sample and will play it at a certain speed. And what's interesting with granular synthesis is that the speed at which you play it back is independent from the speed with which you move within the sound. So, like if you have a tape recorder and you play a tape faster, it will be higher pitch and fast. If you play it slower, lower pitch and slower. But you cannot make it slower, higher pitch. While here you can change the time, some kind of time stretching actually. You can change the evolution of time independently from the speed at which it's read. And what's also interesting, I'm very interested in spatial sounds, in multi-channel sounds, is that you can have different chains of grains, and each like having reading a little bit different place in the buffer. And then when you are surrounded by speakers, you have this kind of decorrelation, which gives a big impression of space compared to the when you have a mono sound and you try to move the mono sound. If you do that, if you're close to a loudspeaker, whatever the movement you do, you only hear it in that speaker. But here, because they are decorrelated, you hear even when you're close to a speaker, you hear the sound which is actually in another speaker much further from you. So it's an interesting way to spatialize sound or to create an impression of space, not localizing it, but creating some kind of thickness in space. That it's not like one sound that you try to move somewhere, but it's just a sound that is wide. And what's interesting with this, but I guess you all know that now because most of you have used sound stretching, I guess. If you just have a voice, this is a spoken voice. If you extend it very much, you get the prosody within the voice. And this is obtained by having this kind of change of grain, which I call elementary and complementary, but you have fade in, fade out, so it creates this kind of continuum. I will skip this. Maybe another reason why I was interested in doing programming was also to find ways to determine the form or the time evolution algorithmically. And like one model that I found interesting was the model of the pendulum. I mean, if you have a pendulum, it will actually, the amplitude after a while will be reduced, but it has this particularity which is called isosynchronicity, that you still keep the same rhythm, but it moves less and less at the end. And here you see zones actually. So I defined zones, and when the pendulum was entering the zone, it would trigger a sound on the sampler and stop it when it went out of the zone. So when you have a big amplitude and the amplitude progressively reduces, you suddenly have some zones which are not activated anymore, but you still feel the pulsation which is also done by notes which are actually triggered on the extremums. I can show a small example, and don't start exactly at the beginning. Actually, this pendulum I could also send forces. Like I could send sinusoidal forces or just noise to kind of disturb it. and getting out of its regularity. And actually all the faders that you see here were actually real faders also, so it became an instrument I could play with. So I recorded for this piece a lot of sequences, looking at using different samplers, different samples, and then playing with things that are not physical, because I could have like the rubbing with air that became negative, so actually the amplitude augments progressively. You can change the gravity or to things which are unlikely in the physical world. So it just became an instrument to create as I explained at the beginning, this notion of séquence-jeu, this notion of musique concrète, where you were recording things with sound bodies. It's a little bit the same principle, but completely transposed in the digital domain. And then, of course, you can start to make accelerations of rhythm and things like this. We don't have so much time, so I won't go further in the piece. And maybe showing things that look interesting, but that are not necessarily. I thought, okay, I'll make it 2D, and I tried different things, and I tried with different lows, and it looked pretty, but actually when I tried to map it to sound, I didn't manage to map something that was interesting. So to me it's also a very important part. It is actually, what do you hear? To me the perception is first, actually. I'm not like a conceptual music composer. I'm really have this phenomenological approach from musique concrète, that I'm really interested in the perception. Let's go to the first example of sensors. I guess you know a little bit what ultrasounds are, and you know the principle of echolocation of bats, that they send a pulse of ultrasound and they wait for the echo from the insect that they're trying to eat, and by the time the sound takes to reach the insect and to come back, they know how far it is. Of course, their system is much more complicated than those sensors that I used, that were actually Polaroid sensors. They were the sensors they put in the photo apparat to actually make the focus depending on the distance of the subject. So basically it's very simple. You send a pulse, you make something with a microprocessor, you measure the time until the echo is there. And to show an example with very simple sound, but I think expressive through the control, it's a sound that is going kind of faster or slower following the speed of the dancer, which is detected with an ultrasound sensor which is in front of him. There's also one layer that he doesn't control. The sensor was here in front of the stage. And in reality, during the show, there was also a specialization. So when he was coming towards the audience, the sound would be projected towards the back of the audience, and when he goes to backstage, the sound would be there. So it was also this element of specialization. It's extremely simple, actually. It's just trying it out, because I mean, it's not like a big richness of the sound, but it's the control that makes the difference. I go back to this granular synthesis because I will have several examples that use it. And if you imagine that the dancer actually, the position of the dancer in stage is actually changing the position where you read the sound. And that will be the next example. Unfortunately, you don't understand French because there were kind of funny sentences from the Orphée movie from Cocteau. Which is sentences like mirrors should reflect more, but reflect like thinking. So she's playing with that by moving towards front of stage, and she's actually moving inside the sound, and the sound is produced is taken from the buffer from the position where she is.
Attention, écoute. Un seul verre d'eau éclaire le monde. Éclaire le monde.
So the sensor is just the little thing here. I put it on top of an antenna so that it was not annoying for the audience. The thing is, maybe about the process actually. Those names that you see are just names of choreographies, of shows actually. But we started working with interaction like in '97 together. And we realized that when we have like a performance with 5-6 dancers and there's a lot of things to rehearse that has nothing to do with interaction, it's sometimes very difficult to find the time in the rehearsal time to actually work in depth with those technologies. So sometimes we decided, okay, we are going to split that over several shows, and we are going to move forward little by little and take the time too. And one time we actually decided, okay, this is about interaction and we are just taking the time to do it. But what I think is interesting is the process, because classical dancers are trained to follow the music, not to generate the music. And when they are generating music, it creates a total different feel for them, a total different way to approach this relationship between sound and movement. And it leads to some directions that might be quite interesting. And at some point, once you reach that direction, maybe the interaction is not needed anymore. Maybe sometimes it happened we thought, actually, do we need to make it so complicated? Maybe we can just do by what a normal sound engineer can do at the desk in a theater. But even in those cases, it has brought us to a certain point. So the path is interesting. I told you I was using the contact mics. So I did, again, very simple things actually. It was taking the RMS value, so the energy of the sound, and then seeing what I could do with it. I started very simple because it started before MSP existed, so I started with electronic RMS circuits that were transformed into MIDI with sensors and then used by Max without the system. And then I had built a 16x16 analog matrix, and it was I would send some sound from CD players, and with I would use the VCR to send it to the speakers in the hall. So I was making kind of at the beginning algorithms in assembly language and then in Max, And just if you have the volume and you decide that below a certain level you might compress or expand, and that you can do the same on the higher parts. And if you use what comes out of that from the same mic but different parameters to different sound layers, like maybe just sounds that are turning in loops, depending on the way the dancer touches the surface, you will create different sounds. And also, if you add some time parameters like attack time, sustain time, a release time, you can get actually a lot of ways to touch a surface and to get different sounds. And having different sound layers that the dancer can actually control. And here is one example where we had built a big podium. Well, big. It was 3 meters by 3 meters, and it was divided in 4 sections. In each of the sections, we had a plate of 1.5 times 1.5 meters, and we had a contact mic underneath. And why underneath? And it was floating, so that because if you put a plate on the ground with a contact mic, the weight of someone standing, let's say the mic is on this side, and you have 1 feet here, and he moves the other feet. This feet will completely damp the signal in the plate, and you will never get it to the mic. So it will depend on where you are on the plate. But if you suspend the plate, you put the mic underneath, you can have something quite evenly on all the surface. And there were different sounds on each of them. What is this? The tweeter doesn't like this sound, it seems. It was a little bit the elements, sounds of fire, sounds of wind, sounds of water, and sounds of voices. So actually I installed the system in the dancer studio, and I explained her how to start the computer, how to think, and she could try for herself. So she did try, and every few days we would meet again, and we would discuss about the things that she liked, that she could control well, how we could modify the things to work better. So at the end it was some shot that was done beforehand and edited. but with the same sound actually, and then sometimes reverse played. And then we went further because the idea of the construction of this podium was motivated by the intention to actually measure the center of gravity of the dancer. So actually the podium was built and was put on each corner of one gauge force sensor, like for heavy weight, because the thing was steel and wood, it was quite heavy. And by simply knowing the weight of the back and forth left sensors, the back and forth right sensor, one can know the X position, and by knowing the two front sensors and the two back sensors, it's very easy to get the Y position. So it was actually possible to determine her position on that 3x3 meter surface. And it was interesting also because it was not I don't find the word. Well, you tend to think that it would be the position of your feet, but it's really the center of gravity. So if she was standing still, but she was moving her arms forward, the center of gravity would change, even if her feet are at the same position. So she had to try to play with that. And like the other example where she was moving into the sound, when you have a lot of sound on a short distance, it really requires some training to be able to go at the right speed to have the sentence set properly. But here it was interesting also that she could play with the phonemes. She could just go from one place to the other and play with it. So I'll play this example. I should say maybe the sentence were organized in two diagonals. It's again French, so you won't understand. And like going to backstage and then going from right to left on stage. And actually at some point, qui m'aille comme un gant, and at some point you will hear at the beginning the gay that will be repeated because she's just playing on that element. You can relate to that. That's a little bit the idea, and of course it's also a play with the word in French. That in this case at the end. Then I don't know. It's kind of getting late already. Well, I worked on a project with it was an Australian director, Maggie Medlin, and it was with a British Australian musician called Stevie Wishart, and she plays the violin, the hurdy-gurdy, and she was playing electronics usually with her acoustical instrument, and she wanted actually to be able to play with her gestures without having to touch knobs of instruments like she used to do before. And it was an interesting project that was called Quartet. The quartet was a musician, a live dancer, a virtual dancer, and a robot. I will have to skip all this because we don't have time. Well, maybe just the architecture that I'm using is like some kind of matrix with real input, real output, and then outputs toward the inputs of the virtual instruments and the output of the virtual instruments re-injected in the matrix. So I can chain instruments, like an analog synth with those kind of matrix that you had on the EMS synths. It's the same principle. And for that for that project I developed some sensors, which are the ones which are in this box, and that I will demonstrate. And the idea was to follow the movements with what was available at that time. So there were like 3-axis accelerometers were available, 3-axis gyroscopes were not. So I had 2-axis one, and the idea was to not have a lot of or not thick wires on the body. So I had the idea of using I2C digital bus. It's only 4 wires, and you can connect several sensors on that bus. And I was also using the system of the theremin. I guess I don't have to explain here what's the theremin. I had actually I will show later. So the sensors was like that. The gyroscope at that time was still as big as this. And then there was the microprocessor and accelerometer. We worked with the instrument maker to make an extension to the touch of the violin, and there was the electronics of 2 oscillators for the theremin. So actually those are like 2 theremin antennas here, and there were also circuits under the I don't know how you say this in English, cordier in French, the thing at the lower end of the violin that holds the string, and actually 2 metal strings were also antennas. So there were 4 antennas in that violin. And the idea for all my sensors, and I still keep it to this day, so like 12 years later, is that I could choose a sensor amongst a list of sensors that were available, and then I can see what is the domain of variation, maximum, minimum, units if there is some, and then I can, at table, I can define what part of the value from the sensor I'm going to use. I can define the minimum and maximum values of the sound parameter. It could be from 0 to 10,000 Hertz, for instance, here, and then define a range of variation at the output. So if the input would be here, then I would have this output here. If it would be there, it would be here. And then I can draw tables. I can have several smoothing algorithms. Like if you're working with accelerometers, they are kind of shaky signals. So it's interesting to smooth it in order to transform it some value that will give you the inclination. Because if you don't smooth, you don't get really interesting results. And just small installation, well, actually not in size. It was like 4 glass recipients with water, and these recipients with water would serve as theremin antennas. And when the visitors would come near, there would be changes in the sound and in the image. And there was also some ultrasound sensors and contact mics that you don't see. bubbles were just for the aesthetics. They had absolutely no other purpose. And we didn't tell the people how to interact. So that's always, I think, the trade-off when you are making an interactive installation is, do you tell the people how to handle it, or do you just let them discover? And sometimes they don't discover anything. It's a little bit frustrating. But sometimes you feel too directive if you have to tell them exactly what to do, and it's not fun either. So, when you have like things like this, sometimes I was surprised by the sound myself, because I had to put some crossed interactions between the different theremin antennas and ultrasound sensors, and of course plenty of combinations I could never have tried on my own, so I was discovering there. Something very interesting, but I cannot go into details. There are some places like at ZKM and in Karlsruhe in Germany where they have this place where they have 44 loudspeakers which are there permanently, and they made this kind of software which they call the zirconium, which allows to specialize, to move things, move sounds on this system. It's really impressive, because when you have so many speakers, you really feel the position. It's almost tactile sensation, and I was using some algorithms I developed myself in Max to actually use some sensors and faders to define trajectories for not only one source but multiple sources, like coordinated movements. I told about contact mics. We've seen an example. This is another example where some mics are put on scenography. The scenography is a metal, it's in metal, and actually there are some parts which are like windows which are metal but with holes, and depending on whether they slide behind or not, if they slide behind you see through like a tulle, but you can also project on it. And it's again with Fred Vaillant at the video, and it was using Isadora for the video, Max MSP for the sound. With cameras behind, so sometimes it's not clear where's the real dancer, where's the camera. We like to play with that. So often there's a mix between the sounds that I do at the sound disk and the sounds that are triggered by them, because there were 4 contact mics on the structure which are triggered by them. And also I told about the mapping. At some cues I just changed the parameters, some visual cues. The sound was on octophonic sound system, so here it's a little bit packed. Oh, nobody told me about this. This was the Wi-Fi from Stanislavski. Sorry. Sorry. So when you do this kind of things, you really need to have all the elements to be able to do it. I mean, this is the kind of thing that you need to be on stage, you need to have the camera, you need to have the light, the correct light, in order to make it, to have the good projector and the sound system. So when you think about it, you think with the scenographer, oh, what would be nice to have, or we could deal where I could put the mics, where the video artist could project the images, but actually it's working, and that's why what I said maybe before, it's like a concrete approach, like musique concrète, but applied to dance. We really are searching, actually. We are spending this, trying different things with the camera, with the sound, with the mic, until we together have something that we find interesting. And this is the example that uses the sensors. Try not to move the microphone there. And those are the sensors. They are quite bulky compared to the new ones. But this is like with the Wi-Fi antenna of those days. And the sensors were like this, and they were attached to the upper arms. So in the following video, there will be the dancer will have those sensors in the upper arm, and this is something that you will be able to try with the same patches as he used. Where is my mouse? Okay. In this case, he's producing all sound. There's no added sound. And again, to show the mapping difference, I just have a small excerpt of exactly the same sensors, but different sounds differently mapped. Here we switch to, again, contact mics. So just by the rubbing on the surface, they give the impression they're holding a conversation. Actually. Well, I will stop it now. And then the question is, should I do, I don't know, how I organize the rest. We could test the sensors, or I could go further and do that at the end.
Как мы хотим? Мы хотим дальше лекцию продолжить, или мы хотим попробовать вот эти вот сенсоры?
Let's test.
Okay,
Test?
yeah, let's test.
Okay, I have to start Max because I didn't have time to do it beforehand. Oh, actually, when we were waiting, I should have done it. Sorry. 5 preferences. It will take a few minutes to launch Max, so if you want to put some lights, it's...
Okay. Да, ну чтобы не включать большое, еще есть
May I ask a question while you...
Yes.
For example, I'd like to know a little bit more about this contact microphones. How does it work? How do you,
That's... maybe I can put again the slide while I'm trying to get all my files into Max. 1 second. Where was it? It was here. No, I cannot both do. Yes, if I'm showing it, well, I can show it, but then I cannot move on with Max. So that's the idea I was trying to explain. So you have like the input level on the horizontal axis and the output level, the one that will control, for instance, the volume of a file that might actually turn a loop. And that is dependent on low and high thresholds and factors, expansion or compression on both sides. You see that actually it can also expand to be vertical at the bottom, and it could. So it's not like restricted to like a normal expander, which only reduces the level below the threshold. Here you can actually increase the level below the threshold. There was an example in the sequence where you heard the rubbing, the real sound of her rubbing the surface. Actually, it was set up so that the lowest the sound, the most they were amplified. So loud sound like hits or what would not be heard, but if she was hardly touching the surface, caressing the surface, then it would be heard.
but how did the mics set up on the body?
No, the mic is on the surface.
On the surface?
Oh, that's what I try to explain. I have those 4 plates, and underneath there's a microphone.
Okay, but when the dancer moves, for example, to produce the voice, and you was trying to determine the center of gravity. It was with mics or with
No.
other technology?
It was 2 different technologies.
Okay.
One was the contact mics,
Okay.
4 contact mics, and the other was the center of gravity with force gauge sensor. It's actually
This is
instruments that are used to weight things, to measure the weight of something. Like if. And they were kind of heavy because they were able to have like 300 kilos, you know. And then there was a small differential amplifier to amplify the signal, and then it was sent to the sensor lab from Stein to be transformed into MIDI and then used by the computer. Yes.
So this surface microphones is not like a simple piezo discs. It's
I didn't use piezo. I used the EKG 411. It's like condenser contact microphones. They are quite good. They are a little bit expensive, but you can. They are immediately symmetrical at the XLR, so you can have long run towards the sound disk. So now, I will start the sensors, and actually they will be like ad hoc. They create like a ad hoc network, Wi-Fi network.
And do you need someone to like put on?
Sorry.
Do you need someone who can move with the sensors?
Yes. I will first.
Some nice girl.
I agree. So I just found the network. It just appeared on my computer, so I'm connecting to it. And let's see on the sensor window if I. Right now I have nothing. I think we have to wait a little bit, and those days.
sorry, but
Yeah, so the sensor just appeared. I'm missing. Okay. So now I have. I will bring the sensor window. And if I take, for instance, the left sensors, I put the gyroscopes here. I put the accelerometers here. And, well, it's this one, obviously. I don't know which one it is. Yes. So those are. So you have. If you see at the left, it's the speed of rotation, one axis and the other axis. You see, very clearly. And when you stop moving, the gyroscope returns to zero because there's no speed of rotation. While with the accelerometer, it never returns to zero because you have always the 1g acceleration of the Earth. So what happens if you move slowly is that this 1g is actually moved from one axis to another. And I'm using that with smoothing actually to change the volumes of different sound according to the attitude in space, but only towards the vertical. In the new sensors that I used yesterday, there are also magnetometers, so I can go further, but here not. So basically, if I have to be careful with the level, like I put the sound. Okay. When it was like a vertical, the two, it was quiet. That's one sound. Another sound. And here I also have the speed. That was controlling granular synthesis.
At the sound you have a sample with
Yeah,
which
I
you
can
work.
show. So this is like my main matrix window, and let's see. You see, for instance, try to follow. This is like a sifflement. How do you say that? Like you hear it. It comes when the sensor. So whenever it's below, it doesn't matter. And here I have like 100 milliseconds for race time, and I don't know. I cannot read because it's not really.
3,000.
3,000, 5,000 for. See, it takes some time to get down. And I have also a table, and I draw. Of course, the table opens in my other window. I had a table so that it was not a linear evolution. And this was this sound. This sound here, you see. So the sound is actually running in loop. I could transpose it here. Or I could use, like I have another sound. where is it? It's on this one, I think. I don't remember. Or maybe it was here. Ah, yes. This is, where is it? It's, the resolution is not really big. Oh, it's this sound. Okay, it's this sound, and you see maybe here, this is the speed. It changes according to the inclination, and that is done in another instrument where I do have like this is on this control on one axis of the accelerometer. I'm changing the pitch, well, the speed of the reading of the file. Here the speed, and here I'm actually controlling the volume. Where was it? Here. No. Yes. So you see the volume goes
How
down.
many different sample files are here?
Sorry?
So how many sample files are here?
In this, well, right now, actually on my other window I have well, in total like about 10. Well, I can have much more actually now, but it was 2007. The computers were not as powerful then, so that was a little bit the limit. So now it can be tried actually by someone. So the idea is to put this around the like around the body, around the waist. So, who wants to try?
I want, of course, but I know that
So maybe you attach it yourself here? So I just have to see which one is the... Okay, so this was the left one. I'm going to put it exactly like it was on the dancer.
Yeah.
And then of course there can be experiments, and it's interesting to see, and now it's if you turn a little bit, put your maybe arm like this, so I put it here. Maybe a little bit lower because it's a little bit tiny, this one. So now if you put your arm down, there's no sound. And we do the same with the other one. Okay. And so here you have another sound. And it's maybe not straight enough. And if you go back, you have the voice. A little bit more volume. And so it's actually accelerometers, like I said, and accelerometers that I smooth in order to have the inclination. But still, if you make a shock, they will trigger even if you're not in the right direction. Because when you have a shock, well, let's show it. When you have, where's the window? When you have a shock with an accelerometer, it's here. You always have acceleration, deceleration when you stop. So there's always this peak. Yes.
Yes?
Well, she had here and on the hand.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And here you have also on this arm, if you go vertical. And you have also the rotation of the arm, the speed, this one, the speed.
Ah, speed. Oh,
actually, it's the speed of rotation, and because the speed doesn't depend on the orientation, like if you put your arm like this, and that you're turning on yourself.
Ah, okay.
Because whether you do like this, or whether you turn your body when it's here, it's exactly the same movement for the gyroscope. You can see the...
But we're supposed to bring some dancers, you know, this dance hall.
Well, what I can do now actually is actually keep just changing the sound. Like, let me see. Okay, let's try this one. Do we have the two? Let me see. Sorry. I forgot to put stereo. So some sounds were going on channels that were not connected.
Amazing. Maybe we give someone more to try.
Well, maybe I give you another sound before. Before then you can try a little bit. I think maybe this one. I think there was also something like if you did like this. Yes, or maybe I don't remember. Do yes. I can put still another one.
Танцуй, как бы, там оно само должно заработать, как бы. Не делать специально.
Сфоткай меня. Okay, maybe next.
Someone else wants to try?
Wow, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It's like an amazing experience.
Okay, I will hold those ones. You can do it first. So, put this in your hand.
And what is it? What's the mic?
No, there's no microphone. This is accelerometers and gyroscopes. Well, that's what I was showing there. It's the signals of the accelerometers and gyroscopes. Maybe some, I don't know how to translate.
Кто-нибудь могут перевести эти два
Да,
слова?
да.
Акселерометр, это что?
Который вот так движение.
Изменить ускорение, как бы.
Ускорение по трем осям в пространстве.
Изменение в пространстве, изменение в
Да,
горизонтали.
Ускорение.
Tell him that I'm sorry, but they are a little bit small and I
But
will
maybe
have
we
to...
put here?
We can do that, but then it will react very differently, so but it's interesting also.
Yes.
Yes. And actually it's interesting to put it to different places. Oh, sorry, this is not enough actually. Well, it should be enough so that it's really it doesn't move depending on away from the body. But then because the dynamic of the forearm is quite different from the dynamic of the upper arm, you get completely different results. And you have to find different gestures to actually make it sound.
But there is no sound from the left hand.
I don't remember this one. I don't hear much. Did we have a problem? Let me see.
No, it's just quiet.
It's maybe just quiet.
But it was working before.
And this is just the vertical. So when you go down, you might go down like this, but you might also go down like this. And then you have another sound.
Just play without moving, without. It's cool. It's something special. As for my impression of my body and my motion.
Yeah, I think both for the performer, it creates something because suddenly you're making sound that you're not used to. But also for the spectator, suddenly a small gesture might become much more visible because it's making sound. So it's like a microscope on the small gesture also.
And do you have some patterns, some presets that generate rhythmic patterns that the dancer is dancing along with the music he creates by his movements?
You mean rhythmical patterns?
Yes, so he moves, he can make a rhythmic pattern, and the way he dances changes this.
There's something a little bit similar in this one. Because I don't remember which one, but there's an accelerometer, and if he was jumping or try to do, then you create this kind of. But you can, or just by jumping, or just.
It's kind of delay.
It's a sound file actually. So it's not a delay, but you're triggering a sound file which has its internal rhythm.
Just try to dance.
What am I doing?
Some rhythmic patterns with your body.
No, it's
Just try it.
You want to do it?
yes, you can.
Why not?
Okay. Can you detach belts? You put this belts? So you want it
On the wrists.
the wrist?
Yes. I think it's better here because there's the dynamics.
The problem is that I'm reaching the end of the stretch. I don't have so it's very you understand?
There is
You have to find out.
I just need to understand the logistics.
You need to try.
Yes.
And then of course I don't remember which song it is. Can you just do that one? And keep it? It's not this one. And maybe you making sure. Can you be a little bit on the side? Because I try to see which volume it is. It's this one, I think. Maybe this one?
There is some work to be done with the sounds to communicate with, but yes, really interesting concept. Yeah.
It's all about
So you
mapping.
can dance and you make the
Yes.
music.
Yes, yes.
Like the ding ding ding, like just the samples.
Yes.
And you can change
Yes.
the beats, something like this.
And if I change, maybe I do this one.
The sounds are too abstract. I just can't. I just don't know how they sound in the real life, so I just can't differ from them.
Their voices.
Yes. Let's continue. There's
Can I try to so desperate to try it, but cannot stand still.
just do it.
You want it here or here? Well, because you're only here.
I think I need more patterns. Different.
You know what? You never use the possibility to have different sounds.
How to do sound.
I change the sound. But the way it is constructed right now is that Maybe one at a time, try to explore what one hand can do, and I'm thinking that also that you have there something perpendicular to the axis. If you do this and this, there you're turning like this, but if you do like this, you have also something else. Okay, thanks. So
I can do it all night. So
yeah, but
we better stop.
You see that? Wait, one has to be the other side. Yes. Yes. And can you detach the belts? So everybody is kind of finding different ways to make it sound, and it's the whole thing. What I said before. I mean, in order to get into something that you want to present on stage, you have to find out what is the best sound assignation to the axis, and how do you play with the axis, because as I said, like you had a sound like this, but it could be like this, it could be like this, but actually it's so if you have it like this, if you turn, you have the same axis. So there are many ways to actually activate the same sensor, and it's not always intuitive. So maybe just I guess the time is in a way running out. But let me see.
But did you organize ensembles? Several people dancing?
No, I had something with one people's sensors and the other's joysticks. This is the European Joystick Orchestra. Let me see recent elements, PowerPoint. There's also something that was quite nice. So some colleagues at the university wrote some programs to actually find those points of similarity between the film sequences and finding the branching points. And there was also the idea to try to sonify the things in a kind of automatic way. So we defined several types of moments or center of gravity of the image, span of the image, etc. And some kind of attempt, I go a little bit further, yeah, like here. So there's a process where it's just a mapping and there's no composition, it's just the gestures that make the sound. It hasn't been explored much further, but I think there's some potential there. And what I wanted to show was actually, because we're talking of theremin and we're the country where it was invented, so actually there was this idea of using the interaction with the system with a theremin antennas, and actually making, okay, I stop it for a moment. The idea was to have like a pit with the image down, and people would look around and they would have, I just don't know how to say this in English, but like you have pieces of wood on all sides where people can actually support themselves, and depending on where they would make the dancer kind of or the sleeping girl kind of move, and also have some interaction with the sound. So this was like a prototype of this, made with just one small screen in the middle, and the idea was to try designs of 8 different types of antennas by pair in each side, by just using aluminium foil and tape and a cutter to actually make those antennas. And then each of the antenna was connected to a circuit. Well, this is a thing that I guess you know all. And when you make a theremin yourself, there's this question of tuning, which is kind of delicate to get the maximum sensitivity. And usually when you just do it with, like I had on the violin, it's very difficult to reach the maximum sensitivity. So there was the idea of using, for the fixed oscillator, a DCO, a digital control oscillator, so that within max I could get to the biggest sensitivity. And then to actually map those things as forces on a virtual physical model. And then the model would be moved by forces depending on the position of the hands. So the antennas are hidden, but they are just below. So that was it for this. It's something I want to use in concerts, but I haven't yet. Some ideas, and then I will skip this actually. Well, we did some kind of interpolation in Max 1D, 2D, 3D, and some DTW, dynamic time warping, in order to recognize gestures. But as we don't have, well, those are the new sensors. Those are the sensors that were used yesterday, actually. So it's basically the same system. I don't have them here, and well, they are very small actually compared to this bulky old stuff. And they do have 3-axis accelerometers, gyroscopes, and magnetometer. It's the same system. It's a digital bus on the body, I2C, and Wi-Fi. Except that we get more signals, and when we got more signals, I will get to it later, we can also fuse data. But one project I want to show, because I think it was really fun, we worked with this guy, and he made this ramp with 20 flames. It was gas, and it was controlled by computer, so it was possible to make patterns. And if you don't have constant gas going, it's like fireballs in the air. So this is like trying some different patterns. And then we devised something with stereoscopic cameras. It's like 2 cameras next to each other to detect in 3D the position of a dancer. And this is some tryout to actually have the flames controlled by his movements through a camera. Actually, the camera is hidden here. So we were trying different patterns. And then you try the same with sensors that he had as his wrists. And that's this one. And so on. And that's where it is important to know actually how the sensors work, because I was kind of making the intensity of the flames with this axis, and then suddenly I wanted to get to my computer, who was on the other side, and I was along the flames, and I put my arm like this, and I moved like this, but it had exactly the same effect. So I was just a big flame next to me. This is the thing about when you get the 3 type of sensors, that you can actually make fusion, get the attitude on each of the sensors, and then reconstitute a skeleton. There's this small video about this. So this again is the sensors as they were used yesterday. Made in 2011. with the 3-axis gyroscopes, accelerometer, magnetometer, and this idea of the digital bus, so you can connect several sensors on the same bus. And on each sensor node there were also analog inputs that could be used. Sometimes I use like a FSR sensors, force sensing. Might be interesting to play with. Maybe you know Alexander Schubert, composer from...
Yes, he was with this зайчими ушами, rabbit ears.
Oh yes?
Yes,
Okay, okay. And he didn't compose this piece with the sensors, but he used those sensors because beforehand he was, lower the volume, he was actually using Y modes actually. And then he tried those sensors, was more comfortable. Well, so we could choose lithium-ion batteries or just 1.5 volts, and this is all the values moving, and you see that you can get the attitude, not only in regard with the vertical, like with the sensors before, but also in the horizontal plane, because you have magnetometer that can find the magnetic node. There is a little bit of lag due to the smoothing of the algorithm, but it's much more stable. Well, that was kind of the thing, the joystick orchestra. There was still one guitar and one girl with sensors. It was just a small example to put in this. Those were students of the conservatory in electro-acoustic music actually, and some students in digital arts at the art school. So we were using the skeleton and algorithms to this is an experience of using a skeleton extracted by the Kinect and hooking up the skeleton part of the arm. And it's interesting in a way that, because you see the arm of the Kinect is really not very stable, with this you have something more stable and that reacts much faster. So it's interesting to have something that has bigger inertia, like the legs and the torso with the Kinect, so you can still know the position without having 30 sensors, but at the same time something that you want to move fast can be done with those inertial sensors. And basically I think, because you've seen the show yesterday, I don't need to show an excerpt. Maybe the last thing I will show. It was something with laser scanners, and it was an interactive installation where you remember I showed you this thing about the pendula at the beginning. I wanted to make like a life-size pendula, and actually it's two. I had 12 meters long catwalks and automatic lights that was controlled by the computer, the movement of the light with profiles. To actually follow the catwalk, and the position of the people were detected by laser scanners. You remember that there were zones in my first slide. Actually, the zones were activated only if people were on it, and if the zones were activated when the pendulum was going through it, it was triggering the sounds. So I'm not very happy about the video, but it just gives an idea. And let's. So you see, when people walk over it, the zone is indicated in the middle, and when the pendulum comes over it, it becomes red and it makes a sound. And some people noticed that the laser scanners were like level of the ground, 5 centimeters, so that when they jumped, they were not detected anymore. They started playing with that. The images on the wall were made by Christian Grobner from Berlin. This was called the Nuit Blanche. It's like a white night in Brussels, and it lasts until 4 in the morning, and then at the end everyone was lying on, on it because it was the end of the night. And that's the end of the talk. Thank you. If you have questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yes,
Yeah,
I have a
that was
question.
amazing.
How can I get these sensors for myself for some tests or something like this?
Well, actually, I never sold them, and I would say that right now there was a company who was in a project with IRCAM in France. It's a Portuguese company. I think it's called Flux or Flux. And they do sell sensors not with the idea of the bus on the body like I use, which I really like for musicians, like if they have a bow they don't want to have the battery on their hands. But actually for the next project with the dancers I bought some of those sensors because I was thinking of making some kind of bracelets that they can put on or remove at different parts of the choreography. They're €100 each. And they have like the Wi-Fi transmitter on each, the small lithium battery, and depending on the size of the battery you have more or less autonomy, you can choose. And you can find them online, and they come, they advise to use one router on one Wi-Fi channel for a maximum of 3 sensors if you're wanting to have them every 5 milliseconds. 6 if you want to have 10 milliseconds. So actually the things that I built in 2011 I would not start building them again. It's a lot of work. While you're doing that you don't do any art, you just do technique, you just do software, you know, the microprocessor development, but also the electronic design. So I would go for buying, because now you can find a lot of things to buy. It's maybe not needed anymore to do those things yourself.
И у меня есть 2 объявления. Первое объявление, что про эту лекцию, что коробка с донейшнами, которая собирается на пуфике, находится вот при входе, такая банка, потому что пуфики арендуем. И второе объявление, что следующая лекция будет в Сколково 17 сентября. Будет ее читать Каплан, это самый как бы большой человек в мире интерфейсов в России и вообще в мире, один из 5 самых таких продвинутых. Он расскажет, на какой ступени сейчас находится подключение проводов к нашему мозгу, подключение интернета. Вот, я думаю, что это всех касается, и, в общем, хорошо бы знать. Вот. Так что спасибо еще раз. Thank you so much for this amazing lecture. Thank you that you come.
Thank you for your attention.
Пожалуйста. Пожалуйста.